Okay, hello, and welcome to today's presentation, a book talk with Dr. Malte Fuhrmann. My name is Sean Swanwick, and I'm the librarian for Middle East and Islamic Studies at Duke University. This is the second talk in an informal series I put together that strives to bring together scholars and collections. One of the reasons for today's talk is to celebrate the recent purchase and cataloging of some 200 historic postcards of Smyrna, present-day Izmir, which will be digitized sometime in the future. I'll put the link in the chat for you to look at. If you have any questions, please direct them to me. I want to thank our sponsors, Duke Middle East Studies Center, Duke University Libraries, Duke Islamic Studies Center, and the History Department, also at Duke. I also want to thank Griffin Orlando, DUMAS Program Assistant, for taking care of so many of different details. A bit of housekeeping. Upon conclusion of the talk, Professor Adam Mestian of Duke will ask Professor Fuhrmann a question or two before opening the discussion to you attendees. If you would like to ask questions, please raise your hand, look in the lower right-hand corner, click on reactions, or insert your question into the chat and Professor Mestian will read the question on your behalf. Turk musun, Rum mu, yoksa İngiliz mi, Fransız mı? Are you Turkish or are you Greek? No. Are you English or are you French? Goes the song To Salvare, at least in one of its iterations, a song that exemplifies some of the changes that took place in the 19th and early 20th centuries amongst Eastern European port cities. Professor Malte Fuhrmann is our guest today and is joining us from Berlin. Since September 2018, he is a research fellow at Zentrum Moderner Orient in Berlin. He is the author of numerous books and articles. Most recently has published a fabulous book. Erudite in scholarship, it is called Port Cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, Urban Culture in the Late Ottoman Empire, and is available at your favorite research library in both print and electronic formats. The book investigates vital changes in the histories of space, consumption, and identities in the port cities of Smyrna, Constantinople, and Salonica, Solun, modern-day parlance, Izmir, Istanbul, and Thessaloniki in the 19th and early 20th century. Since completing this project, Professor Fuhrmann, a scholar of terrific curiosity, has embarked on a new project entitled The Evolution of Developmental Discourse in Bulgaria and Turkey in the Debate on Traffic Infrastructure, which he's already agreed to come back to do to present his findings. Thank you. More information, I'll put more information in the chat in a moment. And with that, I'd like to welcome Professor Malte Fuhrmann. The Zoom is all yours.
Thank you very much for this very nice, very friendly invitation, where I'll try and say a few things about this recent book and what it is about. So my title, Port Cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, is somewhat presumptuous. I do not wish to claim that I am the only one writing about the urban culture of the Eastern Mediterranean, that nobody else has done so. That is not what I'm trying to imply here. In fact, this book has very much profited from discussions with other scholars and from their writings, among others, Adam Mestian, here at Duke. But as you might know, publishers don't like too flowery titles. They prefer something straightforward. My publishers pushed for this one and I accepted it. So I would claim that this is a book about the port cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, even if not the first and also not the ultimate one. And hopefully one that can take this field one specific step further. When looking for textbook works on modern Turkey, Greece, Southeast Europe, the Middle East, or what have you, people do not turn to us, to the urban historians of the Eastern Mediterranean. In part, this phenomenon has a long history in itself. However, I would claim it is also, to some degree, our fault. The way we portray our findings often do not speak to the big discussions people have about these countries and the general region. Oops, just a sec. Yeah. If you look at a photograph like this one, taken sometime around the end of the 19th century on the quays of Izmir, you will see sort of in the center of the picture these pedestrians. What can we say just by looking at them? If you have the picture in front of you on a fairly large screen, you'll see that there are two men with their backs to the cameras dressed in baggy pants, white coats, thick kerchiefs around their fezzes. Overall, one would term this kind of dress traditional. You have, on the other hand, a person walking towards us who is dressed in the perfect Western suit. So if you just take this little part of the picture I'm talking about, if you take that, you could say it's a clash of culture, people on a collision course, what have you. However, there's also the older man in Western style trousers, um, but also wearing a lengthy coat and a fez at the same time, so blending these two different elements. We have even further to the right um, on the screen this other person with very tightly tailored suit, very short beard, plus fez. It is not so much for the modern or against the modern how these people decide to dress. In fact, what they do is they choose various blends of attire to express themselves. What about Salonica? Now, this is 1917, when it is actually not an Ottoman town anymore, but has become part of the Greek kingdom. As you can see, the residents stayed up to date with developments in architecture, such as the recent Art Nouveau style. You find the Olympia's cinema built according to it. But what do people actually go to see? If you can read the billboards of the movies these people are lining up for, one is in French, L'Homme qui assassina, a French movie where the story actually takes place in Istanbul. That is why you can see on the billboard, once again, a man with a fez here, sort of in the center. Also, there's an American movie, Hearts of the West. Although this is occupied Salonica in 1917, you do not actually see many British or French soldiers in the audience or in the crowd. You see a lot of people dressed in civil clothes. You see a lot of women, and in particular, a lot of girls with their white bonnets sticking out here, in also like the center bottom of the picture, but also here. So one can learn that these people still have a lot of interest in topics centered around Istanbul. They easily deal with English or French films, as this is part of the world they inhabit. And the same goes for early 20th century Istanbul. You see more adventures into modern architecture, the prominent building of the Wiener Bankenverein here in the middle in Art Nouveau, for example, and next to it, this mosque with its experimental shape. If you look to the right of the screen, you will see advertisement not only in French Latin letters, but also in Ottoman Arabic, Cyrillic, and Armenian writing. Here to the other side, you might faintly make out advertisement in Latin and Greek letters. To sum up, these were highly diverse places, yet strangely, for a present-day inhabitant of the region, these pictures look rather exotic. Someone born in late 20th or early 21st century Greece or Turkey would look at them differently than someone gazing at an old photograph of Piccadilly Circus, Unter den Linden, or Champs-Élysées. They would not be in the center of a history book on Turkey, Southeast Europe, or the like. They are relegated to our slightly exotic field, the history of the Ottoman cities. As I had said, this is in part due to historiography. You could trace this neglect all the way to Karl Marx, to Max Weber, from whom I have a quote here, past Bernard Lewis or Immanuel Wallerstein. The general idea they share are that cities outside of Europe are not very interesting. This is based on the belief that both the Ottoman Empire and the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole were agricultural societies. Therefore, historians do not have to concern themselves with these cities. If you read this quote and take it literally, that means they are boring. But I would say this is an attitude we have to counter. This is not just an academic question, because this attitude continues to inform the opinions people have about these societies until today. So in order to do that, we have to tackle the more classic issues, the big questions of the modern history of the region. And one of them is Europeanization. That is the question whether this region in the 19th century started to change substantially under the influence of its Western neighbors, and what exactly the nature of this change was. When deciding to tackle this question, I was asking myself, what can I do differently in dealing with these questions as an urban and cultural historian? On the one hand, I obviously choose different phenomena to analyze, but apart from that, I selected a few frameworks in order to make sure that I have a different perspective. One of the frameworks is definitely the city. I don't want to write a history of the Ottoman Empire. Not that there is no Ottoman Empire in this, of course, but I take the city seriously as a space, an urban arena in which the exact forms of what Europeanization will look like is contested, experimented with, perhaps discarded, perhaps transformed in the process. In order to do so, it is important to take the people in the city seriously as agents, no matter what nationality or ethnic identity they had. This is not simply out of political correctness. This is about trying to understand the particular culture that was created in this period, trying to understand it without a priori dividing the urban residents into Greeks, Armenians, and the like. Because more often than not, the experience of the urban space is not that different from community to community. It is also to allow several residents who do not have Ottoman nationality to be seen as part of this urban culture. They were important for it, as I could tell from my work, especially with the Habsburg consular material. Second, Europe or Europeanization is on the one hand the object of my study, but is also one of the perspectives. A lot of people in this time considered the Eastern Mediterranean, or at least their respective city, a corner of Europe, as one contemporary writer, Refik Halit Karay, wrote. You could find a number of other quotes with roughly the same meaning from this period, for example, in the press. What difference does it make? We tend to frame the Ottoman Empire as the antithesis of Europe, as the Orient facing the Occident. But I think that in many ways, we can actually learn more by interpreting some of the social phenomena we see as part of some wider trans-European continuity. I do not want to claim that there were no differences between the Ottoman Empire and the rest of Europe. However, the study of Portugal or Ireland would also lead the historian to concede differences here or there. Also, at least on a theoretical level, we are anyways beyond the point that we claim there is a singular model to European development. Third, I tried to take the Mediterranean dimension this seriously. The sea is, quote, a space of asymmetric relationships and shared experiences among Europe, the Maghreb, and the Middle East. That's a quote from Manuel Bruta and Sakis Gekas. In addition, in my sources, I mix rather liberally different types of sources relating to different social strata and to actions in addition to those related to the written word. The book is organized according to different sections on space, entertainment, and identities. And also The last part deals with how this particular culture I'm talking about comes to an end. I will try to skim briefly over it and perhaps focus a little more on the aspect of identities. But if you just give me a second, the sun's quite low here. I have to briefly um, pull a curtain so I'm not blinded. Just a sec. Okay, here I'm back. So to begin, the question of space in the more narrow sense of the word, the imagined and the constructed space of the Mediterranean cities. What was it determined by? To begin with the Mediterranean dimension. In 1798, the Napoleonic forces defeated the Ottoman ones in Egypt rather easily. As of this time, it is common knowledge that the Ottomans are not a naval power anymore. They could be forced to relinquish their part of the Mediterranean. However, as we all know, this does not happen immediately. For over 100 years, this region remained by and large Ottoman, a few colonies and breakaway states on Ottoman soil notwithstanding. Therefore, the state is no longer the dominant power. When it comes to conceptualizing this region's fate, however, what its future holds, it becomes apparent that you do not have a single new power. Instead, you have several great powers which try to balance each other out. That is, of course, no new insight. It's fairly common knowledge among historians of Europe or the Middle East as well. But the question I try to answer is, what impact does that have on the level of ideology? How is the ideological gap filled once Pax Ottomana has come to an end? I found that its place is taken by something I've called the European dream. From Napoleon's landing in Egypt, past other initiatives by the French embassy in the same time, until the eve of World War I, in different ways, people repeated, reiterated, reformulated a promise to the population of the Ottoman Empire, namely that there is a wider world out there and that the Ottomans could be part of it, of a community of cultured nations, as the scholar Martin Hartmann calls it. The slide shows a few random expressions of this promise around 1860. I find it important to state that this is something different than the white man's burden or other expressions of civilizing missions. It is the claim that the Eastern Mediterranean population could be among the winners of the 19th century process of change. The condition is performance, that the locals should engage with commerce, adapt the cultural fashions emanating out of Western Europe. That is the message the European dream brings across. It's very debatable when in history and by whom that was ever meant genuinely, and at what time such claims were rather meant to pacify the locals, and this need not be resolved in every detail. What is more important to remember, the locals seized upon this vision and acted according to it. We see among these quotes Mehmet Reşit Pasha, a governor of Aydın at the time. However, it was not only elites who embraced the European dream. You will find also middle-class locals expressing their support. Europeanization was not only undertaken to be recognized as equals by foreigners, it was also a tool to process change in a way allowing the residents to live in the cities according to their own desires. One aspect where you can see a solidification of this idea is the quest for a beautiful urban space. Part of the desire for Europeanization touched upon this question of how the cities should look. People at the time were rather unhappy with the waterfront image their cities gave. As you can see here in 1860s Smyrna, these ramshackle warehouses are not the best postcard image a city could hope for. There were long debates in this period about the rebuilding of the quays. There were obviously material and state interests to change the situation, but the new quays were also the result of an initiative for beautification of the cities, for getting a enjoyable, pleasurable space which opens itself not only for commercial transaction, but also recreational one, which then looks like this. After some long struggles, I will not get into here, the seafront is actually changed according to these modern norms of regularity, symmetry, beauty, and efficiency of transport. From these new spaces, new sociabilities evolved. One of the main activities was what was called the corso or volta, which means to get dressed up in chic attire, go up and down the waterfront at sunset, an activity which still exists in some Mediterranean countries today. The topic of sociability leads me to the second section on entertainment. While many activities in some form already existed, especially among foreigners from overseas, several expressions of culture expanded and were now enjoyed by a larger section of the local population. I will only briefly touch on them as I've talked about them in other presentations, but just to list a few, society balls are important events in all of these cities throughout the period. Theater in general, but especially opera, becomes an obsession. I speak in this book of opera mania. Um, and this is something where I very much indebted to the works of um, Adam Mestian and his especially his PhD thesis, where he also touches on opera in Istanbul and people working in the opera business in Istanbul, both local and foreign. As he describes, and my complementary chapters, I must say, I also describe from about the 1830s onwards, this precipitates a huge exchange. That is, artists, musicians, stage builders actually travel from Italy, France, and other distant places in order to meet the Ottoman demand in not only Constantinople, Smyrna, Salonica, but even some towns beyond that. And yeah, just one other example of one of the big theaters of the time. Another commodity I wish to mention is beer. Hardly known around the Eastern Mediterranean at the beginning of the 19th century, it becomes at least the second most popular drink of the region. This, on the one hand, brings forth upscale sites of entertainment, as we see here, the Viennese beer house in Pera, the today's Beyoğlu district of Constantinople, Istanbul, which was also known at the time by the name of its owner, Yanis. But also, beer produced other sites of socialization, which are not necessarily as upper class, nor as old, nor as male as in the previous picture. One can see here in this beer garden. Beer, just as taking part in balls or visiting the opera, was a possibility for people to show their openness to change on the one hand, but also their cultural capital. Especially the balls were opportunities also to perform interethnic harmony. Also, the 19th century European forms of entertainment offered possibilities for intergender sociabilities. So now to the topic of identities, which is obviously one of the central issues in 19th century history for the Eastern Mediterranean. First of all, I would like to play you a short extract from a song which I find helpful for understanding the particularities of identities in this period. And please bear with me as I briefly fiddle around with my screen here in order to find the track and be able to play it to you. Yep, here we have it. Okay, just a sec. Okay. Okay. So, what is this song about? You have to imagine the streets of Smyrna before the Great Fire of 1922. A man approaches a woman and asks her, "Are you Turkish? Are you Greek? Or are you English? Or are you French? You are so beautiful." This is in modern Greek. And after such an aggressive pass, the woman must, of course, in some way put him into his place. So she says, "What is it to you whether I live in Menemen or Cordelio?" These are two different suburbs or nearby towns of Izmir. "And I will wear my shalvar," that's my traditional baggy pants, "any color I like." So why are we dealing with a song which was perhaps sung in some bars back then when trying to assess identities on the Eastern Mediterranean shores? I find it significant because it stresses the aspect of ambivalence. The man begins by asking about the ethnicity of the woman he is attracted to. However, he never manages to make her commit to the one or the other. Also, we don't know whether this woman really wants to get rid of her admirer or simply wards him off to defend her public image. All of these things, including identifying with nationality or local suburbs, are in flux in this song. This is something rather particular to this period in general. Looking for other examples of more fluid identity, I found a number of names in Protestant and Catholic baptism registers in these cities from the beginning of the 20th century. You can see that at least some people have started to mix, to give their children Italian and Arabic names, or German and a Greek one, or German and Turkish, as in the last two examples. This goes to show that there are people who identify positively with mixed cultures and identities. Is the topic of mixed identities or in-betweenness something new? I could definitely not claim so. This has been reflected upon a lot, both in contemporary literature and in later writings. Sheriff Marden draws our attention to the novel Araba Sevdası, Love of Carriages, by Recaizade Mahmud Ekrem, which was first published in 1896. He sees the main character, Bihruz Bey, whom you can sort of identify on the far left of this picture, as a afflicted by a malaise, a feeling of unease, of things being out of place. What is this Bihruz Bey syndrome? It is described as a form of arrested development between East and West, old and new, modern and unmodern. For example, Bihruz Bey, in order to attract the attention of the woman he adores, tries to translate first Persian poetry, then French poetry into Ottoman Turkish. He manages neither. None of them come out right. He has a high interest in material things, modern dress, the canes, the coat he wears, sort of like you can see in the picture on the right-hand side. He despises the simple rural people of his times. This is a character default Mahmoud Ekrem wanted to draw attention to, and of which you can find other examples in contemporary literature. However, while I think that Sheriff Marden's observations are absolutely correct, I think that we can take this a step further if we try to see this not as a phenomenon of Easterners facing the West, but rather of a situation which reflects to some part what people were going through all over Europe, if not all over the world at the time. In this context, I found this quote by Moritz Chaki, as well as his writings in general, very helpful. Chaki reflects here on the Habsburg cities in the 19th century as multicultural sites. He draws on the writings of several contemporary authors to understand the feeling people had of in-betweenness or lack of qualities. Robert Musil's man without qualities is the stereotypical character in these writings. People who are bombarded by different possibilities the modern world offers them, but in the end never really manage to act upon these possibilities which they are confronted with. Instead, as you can see in the comic book version of Robert Musil's Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, Ulrich, the main character, lies in bed and fantasizes about things in the world beyond, based upon what he's read. So this is something I find rather helpful, to look at some German language authors to understand things which also affect people in the urban centers around the Eastern Mediterranean. One of the writers I find particularly helpful is Friedrich Nietzsche. If you look at this short passage, I think what he describes is something similar to what Bihrus Bey and the man without qualities experienced in later decades. The sensation that there are so many different morals, different arts, different aspects bombarding the individual that he or she is no longer able to act upon them. Even if there are great changes in your own time, you end up contemplating things and not really taking part in them anymore. So what do you do if you are afflicted by this malaise, the Bihrus Bey syndrome, or have become a person without qualities? Friedrich Nietzsche's suggestion runs somewhat like this. Look at the more elegant stuff or listen to my summary of it. We cannot take this transitional period we live in seriously, is sort of what he's saying. But what we can do is try to make the most of those freedoms we have. The fact that everything is in flux, that things one day are attached to certain values and the next day are seen very differently. The message is, while this is so, go out there and enjoy it as much as you can. And that is what I see expressed in that song performed here by Muammer Ketengiolu, which I played earlier. Are there more examples of the Mediterranean port cities residents framing their experience of the modern world in a similar vein to Nietzsche? Yes, there are plenty, I find. One very interesting discussion I found in the Journal de Salonique, in a series of letters to the editor from 1895 into early 1896. What were turn of the century Salonica residents discussing in this French language newspaper? The quality of men and women of Salonica. The discussion is kicked off by the editor-in-chief, Vitalis Cohen, writing under his pen name Sheridan. He describes the young unmarried women as the 11th plague Moses forgot to smite Egypt with, showing all their unfulfilled dreams and suppressed desires for a husband. That is how he characterizes these young women. At the end of his lengthy, very sexist satire, what does Cohen suggest to do? Since there are so many brunettes in this town, one might as well send them off to the Mormons in Salt Lake City because they can have 50 wives, and in this way, Salonica could be rid of them. Already back then, media professionals such as Vitalis Cohen knew that provocation will get you readers and retorts, and that way will make you the talk of the town. Nonetheless, I believe even the editors of the paper were surprised about the numbers of letters on this subject that continued to pour in over weeks. In the next issue, we have a letter to the editor by a young lady, as her pseudonym goes. She retorts by heading into the opposite direction, saying, if we, as the young women of Salonica, take so long to inspect what is to be had on the marriage bazaar, it is because we find very few suitable candidates. This is a city of commerce. These men never talk about anything but their business. They do not exercise their bodies. They do not exercise their minds. There's no intellectual, poetic, or idealist activity. When we have to dance with them, they tire easily and do not know how to dance because they have never bothered to learn how. Therefore, the overall interest in Salonica men is low. Next, a male writer pitches in, claiming, yes, it is true, our city is nothing but commerce, therefore life is difficult. He even throws in the Darwinian phrase, struggle for life in the English original. How could we exercise our bodies when we can't even ride a bicycle in this town because it would get stuck in the mud as there are no properly paved streets? Next, another man writes, saying, what is the charm of these women anymore? These days, every woman has a piano, and even the servant personnel dresses as if they are baronesses. He therefore has decided to enjoy his bachelor life a little longer, but accepts that he should, in this case, help his mother and sister with the household, and on and on. What can we read from this very quaint, very middle-class discussion? I think this is actually a straightforward negotiation of contemporary gender roles. It shows that port city residents were unhappy with their ascribed roles, but as becomes apparent, they do not manage to take the decisive step to make the most out of what they have been reading about in their French novels, in the newspapers, which are supposedly a window onto the wider world. Just as Robert Musil's Man Without Qualities, they end up just contemplating on the possibilities of the modern world, still hoping that someday the knight in shining armor or the femme fatale will appear, grab them by the hand and take them out of this conceited, stagnant Salonica in order to lead them to the promises the modern world holds for them. So in a very different genre, this is also a reflection on a malaise. What strikes me is that it does not come out of the advice literature of the late Ottoman period, which has been thoroughly studied in recent years. Instead, this is something resulting from everyday life experiences, and it is described directly by people immediately affected by the condition. I looked at some other publications to answer the question when in this period people actually experienced this feeling of inadequacy, and when people, on the contrary, managed to overcome it and get a sense that they, according to Nietzsche's expressions, managed to live in the light, making the most of this weird transitional period they lived in. There are, in fact, several outlets, it seems, and I'll just briefly name a few in passing. Katja Jana lists cross-dressing as one of them, not dressing perfectly Ottoman, not perfectly Western, but coming up with these weird in-between combinations, as we saw on the first slide of the Smyrna quays. Seçil Yilmaz gives us the example of how a doctor finds medicinal discourse an excuse to speak out openly about sexual intercourse in bourgeois society. Murat Yildiz has used gymnasts as an example of people who broke out of their prescribed gender roles, and this list could be extended. However, there are also a lot of discourses in this period, usually tied to nation building projects or to the concomitant project of creating a national bourgeoisie as a community of sentiment, that is, a community following certain cultural rules. Within these projects, people are instructed to stay away from what is considered excess, the too liberal spirit of the age. I see this trope of literature as standing against this free-spirited, free-minded way of dealing with the modern world. The gist of the argumentation reads, yes, we might need modern math and foreign languages, but on the other hand, we need to focus on our community, on family values and the like. I do not have time to further go into it, but I think a number of you will know the kind of literature I'm referring to. The last major section of the book deals with the disintegration of this particular era during which the urban culture came to its bloom. It comes to an end, on the one hand, by anti-European discourses, but also by a type of angry young man and woman, which Pankaj Mishra speaks about in his Age of Anger. This was for me a very helpful way to address the unraveling of the port cities and the subsequent nationalization of space, of which you see two examples here on the Izmir and the Salonica waterfront respectively, so both times in the center of those port cities. So to sum up, the process of Europeanization was not just a matter of conscious political decision-making by a sultan, his elite bureaucracy, or later political parties. It was an organic process that influenced the culture and the lives of millions and influenced such everyday questions as what to wear, how to lead a conversation, how to spend leisure time, and what qualities to look for in a potential marriage partner. Within this process, it was less the question of making a conscious choice for or against a set toolbox to install modernity, which was waiting there with the instruction manual attached. Modernity was still an ongoing project, and the residents of the port cities decided to jump aboard, believing that it could prove helpful not only to end up among the winners of the New World Order, but also to fulfill their desires for the urban space, pleasure, and identity building. The European dream or promise of joining a world on the move was not a coherent policy, but the result of the gap between an Ottoman imperial center that no longer managed to integrate its subjects into a common imperial narrative of legitimacy, and on the other hand, of the influence of other European countries. These were most of the time present in the later Ottoman sphere more through schools, immigrants, novels, or leisure activities such as having a beer or visiting the opera than through direct political control. However, the psychic tensions of existing in a space exposed to the multiple possibilities of the modern world without a strong state to identify with precipitated counter-discourses to rein in the ongoing free experiment and ultimately the rise of a group of angry young men and women who played an important role in finally seeing the cities they were born in and their cultural order go up in flames. So this is but one contribution that illustrates how the fields of urban and cultural history can lead to more nuanced perceptions of processes that are usually addressed in the framework of political history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malte. I presume I should take it over right now.
Yes, please. And I'll stop showing these slides so we can see the other people in the room.
Great. So first of all, congratulations and thank you so much for this wonderful talk. So a big applause. And I would introduce myself. My name is Adam Mestian, and I'm an assistant professor at Duke University. And I will moderate the conversation after Dr. Fuhrmann's talk. what will happen is that I will pose some humble questions, and then we open the floor for a general discussion. I see many colleagues actually among the attendees, so please feel free to jump in and pose questions anytime, and I will read your questions aloud to Dr. Fuhrmann, and then hopefully we have an interesting conversation. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and the images and the music. I think that these are all fascinating. And I have, of course, I made a really immense amount of notes. So I will restrict myself. I have, let's say I will pose 3 questions, and I start with a small one, and then I will go to general ones. And of course, today it is so fantastic to hear about urban history in the Eastern Mediterranean as something of a European dream, as you called it, obviously, because today what is usually, what we can see usually in that area is the American dream, right? The American promise. This from investment in Istanbul to Mohammed bin Salman's new line. Right, so somehow the city has a different meaning and a different imperial imagination and a different aesthetics, as a different external aesthetics, as at least a reference today. But before I go to these large considerations, I would like to pose a small technical question. I was very happy to see in the book, you didn't really mention it in your talk, but in the book, it's quite clear that you worked a lot in the Austro-Hungarian archives and in the German archives in your research, perhaps also in Italian and Greek archives. So I would first start with this technical question, because I presume, especially for doctoral students and also for us active researchers, this is very important to see what these new sources, as opposed to the usual Ottoman, British, French archives, give you as a perspective. So what is, that is, the Germanophone source material? I see especially the prostitutes are very prominently figure in German language sources. Can you tell us a bit more about, and in general, what does it mean, the Austrian, let's say the Eastern Mediterranean city culture from a, let's say, a middle European perspective, so not from the Western European, and of course not from the American perspective. Thank you.
Should I answer immediately, or are you going to give the other questions too, or?
I think it can be an exchange. So if
okay, let's
now and then
a bit more
the other one, because then the other ones are very different.
Okay. Yes, thank you for giving me this opportunity for talking about some aspects I couldn't quite figure into this 45-minute talk. Yes, so actually my research sort of evolved first out of looking at immigrants into the port city society. And while we, I don't know how much I can should give as a background, in this particular period, a huge amount of residents of these cities did not actually have Ottoman nationality. Another large number, the nationality was disputed. There was a lot of settling down. This happened in part due to sort of organized merchant colonies, which would then expand over the period of time, because after some period, if you were a British subject, you might as well have been a Maltese trying to get out of the overpopulated Maltese islands at the time. Or if you were an Austrian, that could mean lots of things as well. You highly likely you would be from Istria, Dalmatia, so from what is now the Croatian coastline. These people moved around, settled around the Mediterranean. Many parts of the southern Mediterranean were places where people try to find work outside of the region, and they would go, yes, they would go to Alexandria, they would go to Izmir. And in a later period, what you have is another layer, sort of the professionals who have some kind of work experience. So think of the railways. Not everybody can start working on the railways the next day. On the other hand, in Italy and the Austrian Empire, you have a lot of experienced workers. What does that do to the sources? Actually, that means the state of preservation is different. A lot of consular material was burned in the 1922 fire in Izmir, so the records about that town are not as good. But Salonica, from what I can tell you from Berlin and especially Vienna, that is excellent. You can come there and you find endless documentation about the Austrian, what is normally the Austrian and Hungarian residents in that town, but people are very mixed. They've intermarried. They are the grandchildren of somebody who emigrated a century ago. So you have wonderful insights into like social interactions in these towns, as these are court records, inheritance, all kinds of things. I can only definitely advise anybody trying to study these kind of cities to go to Vienna.
Thank you. Yes, my feeling is actually that the next, perhaps one next paradigm change will be when people start to really use the Greek and Italian archives in order to understand the Eastern Mediterranean culture and Eastern Mediterranean city culture. Now, I have I recognize that both in your book and in your talk, you very carefully avoided one single very important concept, actually many important concepts, but certainly one central one, and that is Islam. You did not mention Islam at all, the fact that the Ottoman Empire was a Muslim empire. How does Islam figure in your research? Do you reject any, or would you reject any explanatory power given to, let's say, Islamic law in this context? So how do you see the relationship between urbanization and European capital, and as you would say, the European dream, and Muslim forms of life, or Ottoman, let's say, Ottoman Muslim forms of life?
That's a good one. One more little thing about, you mentioned Italian and Greek sources. A couple of people have wandered into this. Oliver Schmidt, a couple of years ago, used a lot of these Italian sources, and there's a recent PhD by Andreas Guidi about the island of Rhodos, which actually manages to mix Italian, Greek, Ottoman sources, which is, I think, about to be published this year, or at the latest the next. Andreas Guidi, just to keep that in mind. Yes, I must say about my background, I'm a historian with a special training in the Balkan area. I've never studied Islamic studies, even though I work at a center where I have a lot of colleagues who have. Somehow this has apparently not had much of an effect on me. But I don't know. I find it sort of useful to keep as I try to describe, a kind of neutral attitude towards this, towards these cities I study, because I find that Also, as far as rules and laws governing these places goes, they are once again very mixed. You can see it in some of these consular court cases I've tried to study. You will see like a simple divorce case can mix into German consular law, Austrian consular law, the right of the Greek Orthodox Church to actually do marriages, the right of different other states involved, the Greek state in that case. Plus, the Ottoman Empire in itself had in this period um, a double kind of law system. On the one hand, the Sharia, on the other hand, a set of secular law courts which operated at the same time. And this is why one cannot say this is a through and through Islamically coded space, definitely not. I had a second point I was gonna give about that. One thing, of course, is that in these reactions to modernization of culture, lifestyle, there are a lot of counter discourses which try to take as a sort of a base of resistance religion, or I should say religions, because you will just as well find some Greek Orthodox bishops polemicizing against girls going to school balls, as you will be able to find perhaps Muslims polemicizing against mixed audiences in the theater, and worse yet in the cinema, where you have to turn the light off and God knows what happens then. But I find that in the end, it does not make much of a difference whether the polemic comes from Greek Orthodox religion or Islam. These are things which are just sort of, you take as an ingredient to construct a conservative ideology.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This is very helpful. Finally, I would pose a general question, and then I already see that we have some questions, so I will move on. The final general question is that I feel in the book and in your talk as well, and in the book in general, an urge or a call to urban historians to engage more with political arguments or let's say economic history-based interpretations, such as which is very popular in the US, for instance, a neo-Marxist interpretation of historical change. So, do you what do you see in urban history as a discipline that can contribute to these conversations or help more in understanding historical change in itself, temporary change, temporary.
Right. So I think one of the advantages we have is that we can go bottom up rather than top down, as a lot of studies do, which are based on political theory or economic theory. Not saying that there should be no theory. I think theory is very important, but it is also important to kind of let yourself be guided by the empirical data that you see, rather than try to develop patterns from there, rather than trying to see how a model plays down on the local level. For these Ottoman port cities, we are sort of in a discussion with the world system theory historians. There was a lot, this was a very influential wave, you might say, from the 80s to 90s. They ruled completely. They are still rather prominent, even though some of their claims, which we would in that period, from that period, we would rebel against, they have actually more differentiated views on these days. That is like the one discourse we're talking about. However, one can also totally take it to a political level. If we nowadays see, for example, the image of what culture is about, which is used in the political sphere by, say, for example, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has this idea that culture is sort of based on religion. Religion produces the individual, and then the individual is sort of called upon to live this particular culture which is imposed upon him or her. Plus, we could see similar things nowadays with the neoconservative government in Greece, where there is this pretense that Greece is, Greeks live on a different planet than possibly refugees from the Middle East coming into the country. So I think in order to take part in these kind of contemporary debates, it is good to have a grounded idea in cultural history where we can go and challenge such very simple assumptions.
It's so great. I have a lot of questions. And I also must say that I really love that you never mentioned cosmopolitanism as an organizing concept, which is so loaded with nostalgia and so on and so forth. But I don't want to go there. I would rather read aloud right now a question from Philip Jones, who asks, how did Alexandria in Egypt compare to Istanbul and Salonica for cultural melding?
Mm-hmm. This is something where, unfortunately, I have to basically form my opinions from secondary reading. But the thing is, Egypt, from even when it was still sovereign, it was very much more an immigrant city than these others I have mentioned. The immigrants are very prominent in Alexandria. This is because the cotton boom, I think, mostly post or during the American Civil War, the world looks for other sources of cotton. So you need a lot of people, not only in the cotton business itself, in transport business, railways, shipping, in the processing of cotton and the like. So you have a huge number of Italians there, and you have Greeks coming there as well. There's a large Greek community. However, of course, what we have at some point is this question of the foreign colonial power dominating the city, the British, and what this boils down to under British colonial rule. That is, of course, a big difference, even though the British didn't, unlike the French in Algeria, did not impose a one-on-one of their political and legal system. You continue to have these kind of, you might say, mixed legislations, the power of the consuls to rule, to make decisions over their respective community. So on the political level, somewhat in between. On the actual question of mixing, very much mixed. And I found from Anthony Gorman rather convincing arguments that, for example, among labor radicals, people did manage to bridge the gap. You were not just a Greek, you were a Greek worker who would try to work together in improving living conditions, work conditions, together with Egyptians, Italians, and other interested parties.
Thank you. I just want to make a footnote, sorry, because I cannot restrict myself. Egypt was not sovereign, even before 1880.
Sovereign is a stupid
It was
word.
an Ottoman,
Yeah.
province. Egypt became sovereign, well, sovereign in 1922 first. So until then,
Yeah, sorry, what was the
legal
wrong
status
word?
of
I
Egypt.
was looking for something, I threw it in.
So the next question is from Richard Murad Anoshian. Thank you, Dr. Fuhrmann, for a fascinating talk. To what extent do you believe that loyal Ottoman citizens eventually turned to the European dream in frustration of not seeing the implementation of the long-awaited and much desired internal reforms? So this is a question about the, let's say, the Ottoman dream or the Ottoman promise, and instead of...
Yeah. That is true. There's an Ottoman dream in the mid-19th century. There's this idea, okay, maybe it's we are no longer the people making on the way to dominating the world as the Muslim power. So maybe we should try this thing, equality among our citizens, make everybody feel equally happy living under Ottoman rule. I would say that these are not either or questions, for at least not on the ground for people in this period. People, and if you remember, I briefly threw in that comment by the British ambassador in mid-19th century. This is the idea that sort of the European dream could develop in accordance, and it was unclear, would it be perhaps a Greek state by then, or would it actually be the Ottoman Empire in the end? That was sort of not clear, but one of these states was expected to come out on top and be the ones to conform to the European dream, or the other way around. Whatever national movement or state reorganization would work out best for this region, that would be what would conform to the European dream. And likewise, I think that on the local level, a lot of people sort of played in between these different national organizations. It is only then in World War I, or actually first in the Italian Ottoman War of 1911, then in the Balkan Wars, and for the rest of the empire, then in World War I, where this thing that you have loyalties, multiple loyalties. Perhaps you went to a French high school in the Ottoman Empire, you adore French literature. On the other hand, I can once again refer to Adam and his work about some Armenian writers of opera who would perfectly well write an ode to the Sultan, and at the next moment write a patriotic Armenian play about a medieval king or whatever. Everybody was sort of like, oh yeah, fine, good, until there was war, and then you had to sort of choose sides, or sides were chosen for you, one of the two.
Thank you very much. And you reminded me that actually I never brought up the Armenian story, and I should publish that one day. Manas and the
stuff, yeah. I was surprised to see that you totally left out the Istanbul side of your PhD in the book publication.
Yeah, well, the book must have been produced, so that
right.
And that was a different. Anyway, thanks. We have a question from an anonymous attendee, namely that they ask, I wonder if you could comment further on why you think that ports specifically became centers for this new European Ottoman urban culture. Was it simply because they were centers of commerce and therefore European capital, or is there something distinctive about ports and the population of these cities or their urban fabric?
Mhm. Yeah. Um, Thank you for that question. I try to be a bit careful about that. The thing is, I don't want to. There is a problem with this nostalgia, which Adam mentioned, which influenced like this trend of writing about Eastern Mediterranean cities in its earlier phase, especially like the 1990s. People were saying like these are these very unusual places. I don't want to go down that road. I think that you could find probably some inland towns where or inland villages where you had very particular local conditions and where you also found some uh, things which would sort of fit into the scheme. However, these are this is the place where you have the physical contact too in this period. Most of the traffic with Europe doesn't go over land, doesn't go over the roads, doesn't go over the railways once they're built. Most of it, both commodities and people and the newspaper you're waiting for maybe, or the letter you're trying to send, they all come with the steamship. Steamships operate in this part of the world as of the early 1830s already. And so the first people who see a steamship are the people who are on the waterfront in Izmir or Istanbul or later Salonica. They'll also be the first people to see large numbers of possibly tourists from Austria or from Trieste or Marseille or London arriving in their town. These are so there is sort of an uncensored access to novelties coming in. Once again, one should not mystify them, but one has to take into account these are these major nodes of exchange, especially Izmir, which was, besides Alexandria, the largest port of the Eastern Mediterranean, and therefore, at least in the mid-19th century, would usually see cultural change, social change, technical innovations such as the steamship long before people in Istanbul did.
Thank you very much. I would say also that, well, there are some examples for what we can call inland cosmopolitanism, perhaps.
Definitely.
In Cairo itself, for instance, but even in perhaps in today's Turkey, there are some examples. But thank you so much. I don't know if there are more questions, please pose them. If not, then I would say that Sean, would you like to come in and say a few words, concluding words, or you want me to conclude?
You can do the conclusion. I just want to thank the audience after.
Okay, so let me then conclude, and let me thank you so much, Dr. Fuhrmann, for this wonderful talk and your book. And we have, I think, lots of arguments which will be digested in the couple of in the coming years, I suspect. And I wish the best for this book and for yourself and for your next project, which, as I understand, is a different subject on developmentalism in post-Ottoman Bulgaria. Am I correct?
Bulgaria and Turkey from like mid-19th century until mid-20th century. So trying to bridge kind of this system and independence difference of the two centuries. Yes. Road construction and railways construction and what kind of discourse goes with them, basically.
Super. This sounds fascinating, and I look forward to those discussions as well. And I hope we can welcome back with that publication as well soon. So thank you so much for your talk, and I give the floor to Sean I don't know if Ellen McLaren, the director of Dumask, wants to say also a few words. Anyway, I just thank you and thank you everyone, and I mute myself.
I just want to thank you so much for this wonderful talk, and thank you, Adam, for moderating, Sean for organizing, Griffin, thank you for all the logistics, and bringing us together across the globe for this very interesting discussion. Are there any final questions from the audience? Questions? All right, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Sean, we cannot hear you.
Thank you very much. Again, it's just the four of us now. Thank you very much, Malte. That was really awesome. Hopefully someday we can do it in person, maybe with your next project.
Would be great. Let's hope. Yeah.
Thank you, guys.